Thank you for joining this Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues faced by society today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Kevin McCarthy, a partner at Mishcon and chair of the corporate team, and I will be hosting today's event. Before I introduce today's guest, there are some housekeeping points to mention. If you're online, you've joined this session automatically on mute and without video. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen, and I will pick this up. If you have any technical questions during this event, please feel free to let us know via the chat function, and one of the Mishcon team will help you. And if you're in the room, please just raise your hand. Following the initial part of the talk, we will have some time for Q&As, and Nicola has also kindly agreed to stay behind for a little time at the end to sign some copies of her book. So without any further ado, can I please introduce today's guest, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola was leader of the SNP from 2014 to 23, and that followed a period as Deputy First Minister from 2007 to 14. She became the first female and is the longest serving First Minister of Scotland, and brought Scotland to the brink of independence, overseeing the Yes campaign in 2014. And she navigated her country through both Brexit and COVID. She continues as a member of the Scottish Parliament, but has announced her intention not to stand for re-election in May 2026. Nicola, welcome to the Mishcon Academy.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
There's been a lot of interviews following the publication of your book, and I think I've seen some of these, and they've asked a lot of the same questions, and I'd quite like to try to move the discussion along a little bit from those same questions. Let me start by saying you and I first met one another autumn of 1998. Seems an awful long time ago.
1988.
88, you're quite right. Where we met at Glasgow University starting our law degrees. We both came from the west of Scotland, from state education. And I'd like to ask you two questions. One is, why the decision to move into law, but more importantly, what you make of your reflections now and regarding social mobility, and whether that was a big issue then, but also how you view that now.
I mean, my mum and dad would say I was at primary school when I first articulated the ambition to be a lawyer. And it was one of two ambitions I used to speak about back then. The other was I wanted to write children's books. I wanted to be the next Enid Blyton, which clearly didn't happen. And the second of those was understandable because I was a really bookish kid. I read all the time, so imagining myself maybe one day writing books was not a wild thing to do. The ambition to be a lawyer, though, was a bit more perplexing because I don't think I knew any lawyers. I'm not sure I would have been able to really articulate what being a lawyer meant, and yet this was what I wanted to do, and I kind of stuck with it. And as I got older, I knew I wanted to go to Glasgow University. Nobody in my family had gone to university before, so this was a massive thing to aspire to, but that was my focus. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what I did. I remember autumn 1988, setting foot in the Stair building, the law school, and feeling for a long while that I was completely out of my depth and completely in an alien environment, and didn't know whether I would be able to carry on and keep going, but I did. Social mobility, I think it's better than it was back in those days. I mean, I think our year was one of the first when you're getting close to a majority of the students were female, but there was nowhere near a majority of people in the upper reaches or even the middling reaches of the legal profession were female. So there was a sense that while women were increasingly going into professions like law, we weren't sort of rising up the ranks. I think that has changed and got better. Certainly from a working class perspective, I guess there's more people now, even more so than back then, going into university, which is a great thing, doing degrees like law. But I think we've still got a way to go on social mobility to have a society where genuinely how you do in life is down to your talents, and that there's no sense that it's your background or your connections or where you went to school that are the things that still drive that. But I think on that front things are better than they were.
And I recall that even then you were already interested and active in politics. Was that part of what was firing that interest at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I got involved in politics. I was a bit of a weird teenager, obviously. Before I went to university, I joined the SNP when I was in my final year at school. So by the time I got to university, that involvement in the SNP was already established, and it intensified, I guess, at uni when I got involved in student politics. And yeah, I mean, it was what fired my political activism growing up where I did in a former mining community from a working class background, you know, going to a state school, a good state school, but still one where going to university was an absolute rarity. It was not something that very many people did. I was growing up, as you were at the time, when unemployment was really high. There was a sense of lack of economic opportunity. So I guess I was always driven by a personal desire to sort of extend beyond, you know, the boundaries of where I grew up, but a desire to see greater social and economic justice and a world where people could thrive based on talent rather than background or circumstances.
You were doing quite a lot of things quite early. And so in the book you talk about age 22, you turned up at a rally in George Square and you'd misjudged the mood, and therefore you felt that your speech had misjudged the mood also. But you make an interesting observation, and that is that you feel that the need to progress really requires compromise. Compromise is the word that you use. And I just wonder whether, you know, how you see that in today's context. You see so much of, you know, global unrest and conflicts that seem completely intractable, and whether you feel that despite, you know, what position you might instinctively take, it's actually compromise that is required to unlock those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one aspect where we are regressing as a society, and it's not just a UK thing, although it is very much a thing in the UK, but this is a global phenomenon where politics and public discourse generally is becoming much more polarised, and so you're on one side or another, and if you're on, you know, one side, you cannot find any common ground with somebody on the other side. And I think that's a real problem for democracy. Politicians of all stripes have to take a share of responsibility for that. But, you know, throughout my political career, there is much more compromise and collaboration behind the scenes in politics than people are aware of, and that's always been how things work. And, you know, we argue in the floor of parliaments, we argue on television and in debates, but still there's a willingness and an ability to get together and work things through. I think we're losing that right now. And
yet at the same time you say, for example, in relation to Donald Trump, you get frustrated by the amount of kowtowing that people somehow do, rather than, you know, where is the proper stand-up opposition to somebody like that?
So I think it's always got to be a combination of these things. I think in any democracy, any thriving democracy, you need people that are, you know, going to stand for what they believe in, try to argue their corner, hopefully respectfully and civilly, and not shy away from doing that, but equally not get themselves so, you know, into the trenches that they're not able to find common ground. And I think we've lost that balance of things, where it is now much more the case that if you disagree with somebody on one big thing, you cannot possibly find areas to agree with them on. I think bringing Trump into this, which is inevitable and unavoidable, probably even further distorts this debate, because, you know, he is a bit of a sort of breed apart in terms of politicians. And I think across the world right now, and, you know, if I was still in office, I'd be struggling with this as well just now. I think there is just not yet an understanding or a sense of how best to deal with him, to try to, you know, stand up for what you believe in, even if it's running counter to, you know, what he is trying to put forward, but still find a way of getting things done. So I think it's either people are, opposing him, loudly and vocally and viscerally, or they're trying to sort of placate him and sort of gloss over the differences. Where in actual fact, I think globally there needs to be a sort of middle ground there, where there can be actually a lot of what he is doing in America. I'm speaking personally here, but I suspect many people will think this is not just wrong in principle, it's deeply and profoundly concerning for the future of American democracy, which is, and probably always has been, much more fragile than any of us really appreciate. But also on the basis that what happens in America very rarely stays in America, it's got real implications for our democracy as well. There should be an ability to say that and to stand our ground for the sort of democratic values that I think most of us still believe in, while finding a way of working and getting things done. Take one of my successors as First Minister, John Swinney, is in America today, trying within all of these debates around politics that swirl around Trump, nevertheless trying to find some way forward to get a better tariff deal for Scotch whisky. Now, whether that will work or not, we have to wait and see, but I just think that leaders everywhere are still trying to find their feet and how best to deal with somebody who, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, he doesn't play by any of the conventional rules. So the old ways of doing things just don't really cut it with him.
Can I speak to you about, it's almost impossible to have an interview with you and not speak for a while about independence, Scottish independence. But I guess my question...
I've been known to talk about it occasionally.
Yes, I've heard you speak on it before. If we look back to the 2014 referendum, and I'm interested to know whether now, with the benefit of where things stand now, you look on that as a missed opportunity, or whether the fact of the swing away from that yes vote, the proportion of that yes vote, actually indicates that the decision taken at that time was the correct, and independence, had it been delivered at that point, would in fact have been a misstep.
Yeah, there hasn't been a swing away from the yes vote. Support for independence now is higher than it was in 2014. It's still, it hovers around 50%. It was 45% in the referendum. So there hasn't been a swing away from it. Amongst younger people in Scotland, and you'll possibly know this from your own sort of contacts back home, there's very, very strong support for independence. So I think...
What I would say on that front is that type of young vote for change has always been the case, and actually, unfortunately, for something, people get older, and as they get older, the dial starts to swing back, and so...
Yeah, so far, and it's more than a decade now since the referendum, the opinion polling, for what it's worth, suggests that sort of very, conventional thing of people, say people get more small c conservative as they get older, they get less sort of radical and idealist when they get older, and responsibilities of life kick in. So far, in terms of the independence vote, that's not happening. So the people who were 16 and voted yes in 2014 are 26, 27 now, and are still supporting, and so it's moving up the age spectrum is what the polls are showing just now. Whether that continues to be the case, time will tell. In terms of lost, obviously I think it was a lost opportunity. That's not going to surprise you, given my stance on the debate. I changed my mind even all these years later. I still change my mind about whether, if the campaign I was part of had just made a better argument on certain of the big issues at the heart of the debate, we might have just got it over the line, versus on other days, I think actually we probably got it as far as we could in that moment. Because if you think back at the start of the independence referendum, support for yes was about 30%, and we got it to 45%. Maybe in that moment in time, that was as far as we could take it. So I don't know, I still chop and change my mind a little bit about that, and maybe always will. I think the demographics, and you can look at Ireland just now, and I'm not an expert on public opinion in Ireland, but I think you're seeing some of the same demographic trends for different reasons happening there. I think the demographics are leading Scotland to a point of being independent at some point in the future, and I think for me that's a positive. I think it's in a turbulent world. I think the more you can chart your own course and control your own destiny, the better. But I've also believed, I mean, I'm an internationalist, and I think sometimes it's assumed that if you support Scottish independence, you're kind of inward looking and want to sort of, you know, almost cut Scotland off from the world. That's not the case. I would love us to be back in the European Union. I want Scotland to have a voice in the world. I think the relationships across the British Isles, I think, could be much better and stronger and more constructive if there was more of a relationship of equals, if we didn't have a situation where, you know, just as an example, Scotland can find itself outside the EU, even although by a significant margin we wanted to stay in. So I think it's I think, and I make this prediction at the end of my book, and again, time will tell whether I'm right or hopelessly wrong, but I think it's a rewiring of the relationships across the British Isles. I think will happen over the next couple of decades. I think Scotland will become independent. I think that will inevitably mean that Wales wants more autonomy. I think Scotland becoming independent and Wales more autonomous, of course, by definition, means more self-government for England, which I think it's not for me to say, but I think that could be healthy. I think the drivers are different, don't necessarily hang and fall on the other things, but I think a unified Ireland at some point over the next couple of decades is more probable than not. And, you know, one of the reflections I often have, when I was First Minister, I used to attend the British Irish Council, you know, one of the institutions that came out of the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Irish peace process. And around the table of the British Irish Council, you know, the United Kingdom government, the Republic of Ireland, the devolved administrations, the Crown dependencies. And if the kind of rewiring that I'm talking about comes to fruition, we're also around that table, cooperating and collaborating. It's just the status of the component parts and the relationships between them change, and in my view, change in a way that is potentially constructive and healthy. So Scottish independence for me is not about separation. It's not about, you know, pulling Scotland away from the world. It's actually the opposite, being able to, you know, control our own fate at home, but play a part, hopefully a constructive part in the British Isles and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really interesting point about internationalism, and it's a question which is more to do with the individual that I'm going to ask rather than necessarily the country. But I've always believed that Scots, and it's not just Scots, it's like nationals who live outside their own country, come to have a perhaps certainly a more rounded but perhaps a better understanding of their country for the fact that they actually look at it from a different perspective. And it applies not just to how they look at their country, but also how they consider themselves, perhaps more confidently, etc. And I guess my question is, as somebody who's never left Scotland to live, whether perhaps you have a more parochial view of Scotland than you would have had you spent time outside, understanding better how the world regards Scotland.
I mean, I kind of agree with the premise of your question, so I don't want to kind of immediately sound as if I'm arguing against it. I don't think it's... I think I'm probably going to, unusually for a politician and the kind of person who's usually, you know, injecting the pejorative language into a debate, I don't think it's... I think, well, you're right about people who leave Scotland and look at, or leave any country and look at it from the outside. I don't think it then follows that people who never do that are parochial or, you know, have an insular view or don't understand the world. I think that's where people in Scotland, I'm not talking about you obviously, sometimes feel slightly patronised by, you know, people who've moved away, and, you know, there's a feeling that there's then this kind of superiority complex, that they're more sophisticated and understand the world better. So I think we've just got to be both of those perspectives. They're different, they're valid, and the kind of meshing of them and the intermingling of them is probably where we get the best view overall. I've, you know, in the couple of weeks since I published the book, I've been talking a bit about, you know, when I stand down from Parliament next year, of me moving out of Scotland for not forever, but for a period. And actually for that reason, because I've never...
To join the London dinner party set?
I'm not sure I'll ever be all that
Whatever
comfortable
that
in the
is.
London dinner party set, whatever that is. If you want to invite me to the London dinner party set,
I'm not sure my
Kevin.
dinner parties are the ones they were talking about, but
But
anyway.
do you know what? Yeah, that's the reference in there. Maybe London, maybe not London. I don't know. But it's that point. Because of the career I pursued, and I've never had the opportunity to live outside of Scotland, and I think it would be healthy from my perspective. I don't think I'm parochial for not having lived outside of Scotland, but I think my perspective would benefit from a period of looking into the country from outside. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying I kind of agree with you, but I think there's care has got to be taken not to make that argument sound a bit condescending to people who, most people who are born in a country live in that country all their life. It's a relatively small number of people who will move away. And I think, talk about the virtues of that and the benefits of that, but I think we need to take care not to sort of, be patronising to people who stay at home and do all the work that needs to be done and try to build the country.
Sure. Can I talk to you about your relationship with Alex Salmond?
Yeah.
I mean,
we could be here for a long time,
sure?
but yeah.
It's actually a very pointed question I want to ask, because obviously you and he were kind of very, very influential people working together, and in some respects actually in the book, in a way that I hadn't realised, your relationship clearly ebbed and flowed. Two very, very different types of character in terms of how you approach the job. I mean, it still beggars belief, if indeed true, that he hadn't read the white paper.
No, it's true.
And at the same time, your approach is one of you can't do enough, and so once you've read it, you read it again, and so it goes. But the question I want to ask is, you considered, especially following his death last year, whether it was actually appropriate to leave the chapter in the book and whether to address the whole kind of allegations side of things at all. And yet you decided to do that. I'm just interested to hear a little bit about why you chose to go that way rather than what you were also considering, and that was perhaps not to do so.
I don't know how much people are aware of the background to all of this, so I may be talking at a level that is assuming knowledge that isn't there, but Alec and I were, a very close political partnership for many years. Certain allegations were made against him, sexual misconduct allegations. He was acquitted of criminal conduct, but there was still, a sort of sense that he hadn't necessarily always behaved in the way that he should have done towards women. So that's the background. He kind of wanted me, when it first came to light, he kind of wanted me to help him. I was First Minister at the time, so make it all go away. I wouldn't do that, so he fell out with me. And the rest is history. At the point he died, it had all been history, I probably would have left it alone. I don't want to constantly have to, go over what was a really painful episode in my life. I went through, almost a kind of grieving process when our relationship broke down, and then again when he died. But the reason I wouldn't have been true to myself to do that is because right up until the moment he died, he was alleging that what happened was all some great conspiracy against him, a conspiracy that must have involved, a number of women making allegations for what motivation, I don't know, the police, the Crown Office, senior ministers, civil servants, that I was part of this. And he was still alleging that because obviously he felt it easier to believe that than to candidly accept that maybe his behaviour had fallen short. Associates of his, supporters of his, to this day still accuse me of that. And there's rarely a week goes by in Scotland when somebody on his behalf is saying that I orchestrated this conspiracy against him, and that's why he ended up accused of these things. I still to this day don't understand what my motive for that was meant to have been, but it's not true. And had I just decided to stay silent, I would implicitly have been kind of accepting that version of events. It was important to me. I hope it's important to others who were really hurt by those conspiracy allegations to lay out what actually happened, and that's what I've done in the book. And I would love to have been able to draw a line under it and not go into all of that, but when you're still on a weekly basis hearing these accusations, then I think I have a right, and I think I almost had a duty to set out, and I try to do it forensically, I try to do it as dispassionately as I can to set out the facts of the matter and what was actually the case.
Yeah, thank you. So taking things a step back again, as a lawyer who also became and is a politician, those two worlds of politics and law are actually very, very closely connected. And so, for example, when I think about Mishcon as a firm, we are a firm who've often been at the forefront of that intersection. So decriminalising homosexuality, that was something we were very much involved in. Likewise, challenges to the Brexit process, twice over, we were heavily involved in that. More recently, pursuing legal action for a pardon for Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain. These are things which this as a firm have been very much involved in. But you too have also been very active, I think, in that intersection between law and politics. So I think about the work that you did to attempt to repeal Section 28, your work in relation to women's rights and transgender rights, and perhaps one of the more high-profile issues to do with gender identification and the Scottish approach to that. I'm particularly interested to hear what your views are. I mean, I know what they are, but a bit more detail in relation to the Supreme Court's judgment along those lines, where effectively they ruled on the binary nature of sex, and what your views in relation to that are and how it interacts with what Scotland was trying to do.
I mean, you say the Scottish approach, and just to, I guess, pick up on that first of all, Scotland wasn't doing it something, wasn't being groundbreaking on this. The legislation that passed through the Scottish Parliament and was voted for by people in all parties, and was the genesis of was a very strong cross-party consensus originally, has been on the statute book in the Republic of Ireland for a decade. It's been on the statute book of several countries around the world. So we weren't taking a Scottish approach and trying to do something nobody had ever done before. And I think that's context that's sometimes lost. On the Supreme Court, I mean, firstly, I'm a, as you would expect, not just because I'm a lawyer, because I think every democratic politician should say this, and the fact that this is actually now a controversial statement probably tells us a lot about the state of politics and democracy these days. But I believe fundamentally in the rule of law. So whatever I think of an issue, what a court decides the law is what the law is. And no politician should argue against that. That is not the same thing as saying that you should not then say, well, if that's what the Supreme Court says the law is, then that is what the law is. But I think the law shouldn't be that, and therefore I want to try to change that law. And I think that is perfectly legitimate, and that's how politics progress. That's how change happens, as people make a case to change the law. I mean, that's a general statement, not just about the trans ruling. On that, look, I believe, and people can agree or disagree, I've fought for women's rights all my life. I will fight for women's rights till the day I die. I also think it's important, and I will also always do this, stand up for respect and dignity of minorities who face a lot of discrimination and stigma. And trans people probably face more of that than most other people in life. And I think what we need to try to get to as a society, and actually until the last few years, I think you could say we were already there in many respects. Trans people have always existed. They haven't just been created in the last few years and always will exist. We need to get to a place where women's rights can be protected. That's really important and enhanced, but trans people can live with dignity. And my concern about the Supreme Court ruling, and I don't gainsay that is the law because they say it's the law and they're the highest court in the land, is that the way we're reacting to that, and I mean we collectively as a country, seems to be trying to almost make trans lives very difficult to live in dignity. And I don't think that's what we should do. So I think we should all take a step back and say, how do we achieve two things that I don't think are irreconcilable? women's rights, the threat to women throughout my lifetime and for generations before I was born comes from abusive men. And yes, you will get some abusive men who try to attach themselves to other communities, like the trans community being one of them. But we deal with the bad people in any group in society. Don't tarnish the entire group. So let's try and get to a position where we have women's rights protected, but we also allow trans people to live with respect and dignity. And maybe I'm just a hopeless, naive optimist, but I don't believe that is beyond us, and it shouldn't be beyond us. It might involve all of us dialing down the rhetoric, and maybe a bit of dialing down the rhetoric in all sorts of issues would do us all the world of good right now. But I think we can get there.
On an issue like that, where views are held so dearly and fundamentally, is that, for example, an area where compromise is a solution, going back to what we discussed earlier? Or is
compromise has got to be a solution. I mean, this is, I think, what we've lost over my time in politics, is that compromise doesn't and shouldn't mean abandoning your principles. It means people coming at issues from different perspectives, finding where there can be common ground. And yes, I believe we need compromise on all sorts of issues, but there's got to be a willingness to find that. And I think on all sorts of debates right now, and I've been a politician for 30 years, I bear my share of responsibility for this. What we've lost is that willingness to get out of our respective trenches and find the common ground. And until we get that back, it's going to be really difficult to make progress on some of these controversial issues, particularly so, and whenever I say this on the trans issue, I get howls of, people misrepresent what I mean. I don't mean that people who disagree with me are all, transphobes or misogynists or sexist or racist or whatever, but debates like this one, and I still, defies belief in my part that even people on the other side of this debate for me can't see this reality. Debates like this one are deliberately being stirred up by people who do have malign motives, who want to not just roll back on trans rights, but want to roll back on women's rights and gay rights and rights for minority communities. There's one of the big ironies at the heart of the trans debate is some of the most vocal anti-trans people you will find will also be wanting to take away abortion rights for women, will be against women's rights in other ways, will want to see women back in the the kitchen where they belong, kind of thing. And that's not tarring everybody with that brush, of course not even the majority. But if we can't see the malign influences at work in some of these issues right now, then we're being willfully blind, and we've got to understand that.
So in the book you talk a lot about women's place in politics, and there's a frustration, if not even an anger, that sort of pervades some of how you view how women are treated in a way that men wouldn't be treated in the same circumstances. That's not a
political thing, Kevin. There's many women in this room who can speak for themselves and experiences in the legal profession, but I don't know that there's, I hope it's a lot better today than it was in my younger days, but it's not a politics thing, it's a societal thing. Women are judged differently, treated differently in many, many respects. In politics that will range from much more focus and criticism of what you wear and how you look. Women get judged on the tone of their voice. Characteristics that in men are seen as positives and attributes, in women are seen as, so if you're really decisive as a male politician, you're a strong leader. If you're really decisive as a woman politician, you tend to be bossy and not a team player. And you can take these examples and spread them probably in every walk of life, and that's a reality. But
in a way, Nicola, it's actually your own position that I wanted to focus on, because one of the interesting things you say is in the context of your pregnancy and then the lead up to what was an election, you questioned yourself whether a heavily pregnant Nicola would actually be able to perform and land in the way. And so in some respects you were asking that question of yourself, and I guess
I was asking it of the public. I genuinely, to this day, I don't know the answer to that. This was
that's my question.
2010, so not that long ago. But you know, easy to forget that it was nevertheless a time when no senior woman in politics had given birth in office. We hadn't had Jacinda Ardern, or, you know, there's a few others now. So I had no idea how, you know, if I hadn't had a miscarriage, I'd have been 6 months pregnant at an election campaign. I was the deputy leader of my party, my country, standing for re-election myself, you know, helping lead my party's election campaign. I didn't know how that would be viewed. But obviously there were other anxieties. Would I cope physically? You know, election campaigns are not for the faint-hearted. They're tough things to go through. So yes, that was about me and my doubts and insecurities, but that was me reflecting a sort of sense of not knowing how society was going to. And I suspect there will be many more women than you realise will have had these thoughts about, you know, their own careers and their own jobs about at these moments in their life. And I think on that front it has got better, but across a whole range of things, women are judged differently. Now you might say, well, fine, we are different, so that's okay, but it's a reality that women are judged differently to men, and there's a very gendered assessment of things, certainly in politics, but I really don't believe that is unique to politics.
Can I move on and speak a little bit about the COVID and the pandemic? I think I'm not alone in believing that actually you came out of that process, that whole period, with your reputation enhanced. People felt that, and I speak from my own circle of friends in Scotland, for example, they would say that you spoke with a clarity and a compassion and a transparency, you know, daily about how things were going in a way that perhaps was not always the case elsewhere within the UK. And yet at the same time, you then came in for quite strong questioning and criticism during the inquiry. And I know that landed with you very, very hard. And the question that I want to ask about is a very specific one, and that is that after that event, and because of the toll it had taken on you, you decided to seek therapy. And I think that's something that a lot of people find very difficult to do, to take that step and seek professional help. And I'm just interested in, you know, not necessarily the background as to what had triggered it, but the steps within yourself, the thought process within yourself that took you from this strong, you know, forthright politician to somebody who decided to go and seek professional help in relation to where you found yourself.
I mean, I just realised I was in a pretty bad place, and thought that I should do something about it, because I didn't think it was irretrievable, or, you know, I thought it was, for the first time in my life, I needed some help to get myself from the kind of pit that I had fallen into to back onto an even keel. And I, you know, like you, grew up in the west of Scotland. You know, these are not easy things.
We don't talk about these things.
We don't, and you are conditioned to think that seeking help for, you know, that kind of thing is a sign of weakness, when it's not. Actually, it's probably the opposite. It's probably doing that is actually, you know, taking a step that is about strong, you know, being strong. And so, you know, that's basically, and I'm glad I did. I didn't, in doing it, I suppose I was just, I need to try and do something, because I've always been able to lift myself out of, you know, difficult times, or, you know, things that I've, you know, had been struggling with in life. And in that moment I felt I couldn't, and I didn't know if speaking to somebody would help. It did, and, you know, it didn't actually take very long to get me back into a better place. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't miraculously resolve everything that, you know, has brought you there, but it certainly helped me cope with it. And I would say, you know, I think as a society we need to, and again, I think it's night and day now to how it was when I was younger. I just think we need to be much more open about, just like physical health, sometimes you need to get proper qualified help. With mental health, I think that is equally true, and you know, we need to be much more open about it.
In the book, you actually go into quite a lot of really quite private stuff. I mean, you talk about your own experiences of workplace bullying, you talk about your own sexuality, you talk about baby loss. I mean, these are big things that you choose to address within the book. And you say that part of the reason, the primary reason for doing that is because in broaching those subjects and discussing about them, you feel that there is an ability to then redraw the boundary and close. And I just wonder whether, if you go to these places willingly, is it actually ever possible to then hope to close the curtains again? And that's
I think maybe not, and time will tell. But I guess that question kind of assumes that I had that kind of privacy anyway, and I've opened it up so I can't close it down again. Part of the reason for doing it is, you're outside looking in, as we've established, but in Scotland, my life is talked about and I'm not complaining about it. I put myself into the public eye, but my life is talked about. It is often caricatured. There are versions of my life I have read about in the media over the years that frankly bear no relation to the reality. So this was my opportunity to tell my story and give a version of my life, or not a version, give my life in my own words. And to then, in some ways I'm writing this book at a transition point of my life, and then so people can read about all of these things that they've had the media version of. You can, if you want to, now read it in my words. And from now on, I'm not naive enough to think that I'll just be able to live entirely anonymously and privately, but I can pick and choose now what I choose to talk about openly and what I don't. And that is a right I am going to exercise. And the media or sections of the media might not easily respect that, but I still think I'm going to have a go at doing it.
There's a lot of self-criticism in the book. And there's a lot of...
Not enough, according to some of my critics.
Well, lots of self-criticism, lots of red wine and lots of tears. And
I've always been one of life's great criers.
Well, it's interesting. So, I guess my question is, I think, again, I know the answer, but, do you feel that perhaps you were not as robust, or were you overly critical of yourself, or were you perhaps not as robust as you might have been, or...
Do you know what, the thing about very senior politicians who, everybody thinks they know, and to some extent do know, but don't know everything. We're all fundamentally, this is the most controversial statement I'll ever utter, politicians are also just human. And sometimes that gets overlooked, that gets missed, and the media versions are what people think is the reality. We're all a bit flawed, we're all a bit fragile at times, we're all a bit vulnerable at times, and maybe politics would be a bit better if we just all sat crying all the time, but there was just more of a recognition that people who lead parties, lead countries, lead government departments are human beings that make mistakes, that try to learn from those mistakes, and I just think the state of politics might be better if we recognise that. And there is a sense in politics that you have to always put forward this absolutely kind of steely, in control of it. And I try to do that as well, but behind that, at some point, everybody will struggle. And maybe just a bit more recognition of that would help all of us. So I don't agree I wasn't robust enough. I think I was pretty robust, but nobody is utterly immune from all the things that go on in life. And I don't think I'm too self-critical. I think it is important. I didn't want to write a book about my life and career that just, like a lot of political memoirs do, frankly, that just says, wasn't I great and didn't I do everything right? And, I wanted to write something that was a bit more open, a bit more candid, a bit more human, I guess. And that's what I've tried to do. And you know what, now, and there's a sense of release and liberation in putting it out there as well now, because, well, there it is. That's my life in my words. And I'm obviously subjective about my own life, but there you go, we all are. My life has intersected with this incredibly momentous period in the history of my country, and I've had a incredibly privileged vantage point in all of that. So it's a story of my life. It's a snapshot of the country over the course of my life, and I hope it's open. I hope it's readable. I hope people learn something they didn't know before. And if for the people who hate me and have an immovable view of me, then that's fine. You know, I'm never going to change your mind. But for those who, you know, want to maybe understand a bit more about these events that have played out across the media, then hopefully it offers something.
So the book is a story of your life to this point, and I guess it begs the question, what does the future hold for Nicola Sturgeon? You know, people are interested. I'm interested to hear where and what you think you might be doing from this point.
So I stand down from Parliament in a few months' time, next spring. I have got various different things that, you know, I'm working on just now that you will possibly hear about in the fullness of time, and you know, I'm not going to go into them right now because they're all still at a fairly early stage. I'd love to write more. I enjoyed writing this book. I think it's the kind of book, even though I'm still only, I hope, at the kind of roughly midway point in my life, I don't think I'll ever write another book like this. You'll be glad to know. But I'm a great reader of fiction. I'd love to try my hand at writing a novel, and who knows, I might not be able to do it, but I'd love to do that. You know, I care a lot about, you know, the state of Scotland, the UK, the world. Lots of issues I feel really passionate about. You know, the state of the climate, women's rights, you know, the prospects and opportunities of young people. And so everything I'm thinking about doing, they're all kind of roughly in that kind of space. And I'm looking forward to it, and you know, hopefully I'll be able to unveil some of it in due course.
I suspect we haven't heard the last. So on that note, maybe we bring this part of the session to a close and we can open things to the floor. So we have one roving mic. I will try to make sure that people have the mic in hand before they speak. We also have an online chat function, which questions are coming through from those who are online.
So questions online. Nicola, the first question, which will probably be the toughest question you're going to get today. Celtics or Rangers?
Celtic or Rangers?
Celtics or Rangers. Sorry, I sounded that wrong,
neither. I should say Rangers is situated in my constituency, so I am the member of the Scottish Parliament for Rangers Football Club. I'm not a massive football fan, but my team, which I was brought up by my father to always give this answer, is Ayr United. So.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Although I did read with some interest that you had a wry smile on your face at some point when England weren't doing so well.
I'm a huge Lionesses supporter, and that's my getting that in before I tell you the story. It was just after Brexit, actually. The President of Ireland was over visiting, and him and I were at this concert in the Glasgow Concert Hall, a sort of Celtic music concert, and this was 2016. It was during the European Championships at the time. That night, England was playing Iceland, in Iceland, I think, or wherever the competition was being held. Anyway, England unfortunately lost to Iceland that night, and as Michael D. Higgins, the president, and I were getting into a lift after this event, somebody told us the football score. And all I say is we had a tiny little moment of kind of Celtic gloating. But that was as far as it went.
You see, now, if you move to London...
Are you telling me now, Kevin, that you have moved so far away from your roots that you now support England at football?
So what's the next question, Carrie?
I heard he was a Spurs fan now. Okay, the next question is, how can sexism in politics perpetuated by mainstream media be tackled?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's a simple answer. I think we still need to see more women in politics. I think the kind of everyday sexism that's not just from the media but comes from all quarters needs to be tackled and challenged and constantly called out. And it's really important that is not just the responsibility of women to do. I think for women's equality to really reach where we need it to be, we need men to stand up and challenge and call out sexism as well when they see it. And I think the bigger problem that I don't know the answer to, and it's not just a problem for women's rights, I think we need to find some way of getting to a better place around social media and how all of that operates, and get the advantages of social media because it has many, while dealing better with the very considerable downside of it, which is toxifying the sort of political and public sphere for everybody, but I think particularly for women and minorities.
I'll pass it back for those in the room.
So we're going to ask for some questions from the room now. So can we have hands for any questions that we may have? So can we come here first, and then second we'll go to the back of the room.
The SNP lost a number of their Westminster seats in the last election. I was just going to ask you about the reasons behind that, and how do you think the SNP can rebuild if they can?
Thank you. I mean, I think Scottish politics has moved on quite a lot since then. We are 8 months away from a Scottish Parliament election, and I wouldn't take anything for granted. Reform are making inroads into Scottish politics in a way that I wouldn't have believed just a few years ago. So I think there's big issues there. But I don't think there's many people right now who would bet against the SNP winning the Scottish Parliament election next year, which is quite extraordinary after how almost 2 decades in government. In terms of the Westminster election last year, many different factors obviously denting support for the SNP. I think more fundamentally there was a sense, obviously UK-wide, given the outcome of the election last year, that a change of government was needed, that people wanted to see the back of the Tories for a variety of different reasons. That was the feeling in Scotland as well, and the sense that voting Labour to get the Tories out and get a change of government was the way to do that. And I think that is the fundamental thing that happened. I think there's a lot of buyer's regret now. I don't know, I can't speak for people elsewhere in the UK, but in Scotland I think there's a lot of buyer's regret and a sense of Labour not having lived up in any way to the hope or the expectations that people had when they voted, which is why things have turned again to the point that I started my answer with. But I think, final point on this, and this has changed since my younger days in politics, when political alignment was very fixed. So I joined the SNP when we were not the force we are today, and it always seemed like we were trying to eat into that kind of impregnable Labour support that went down generations. I vote Labour because my parents voted Labour and my grandparents voted Labour. Political loyalty was very ingrained. We now live in an era where that's not the case, where there's a lot of political volatility. People will vote one way in one election and another way, and I think that's a challenge to all politicians, that you can't take things for granted. So while I'm saying I think the SNP will win the election next year, and the polls suggest that, I think we'd be daft to assume that would be the case. We really, all of us in politics, and I'm about to leave obviously, but need to constantly be making the case for why we have the answers to the challenges people are facing.
Thank you. We have a question from over here.
You just touched on it, but do you think reform in Scotland could get the kind of support and maybe even potential electoral breakthrough that might happen in England?
So the short answer to that is yes, I think they potentially could. So reforms levels of support in Scotland are generally, obviously there'll be pockets of the country where this is different, but on average, reforms level of support is lower in Scotland than it is across England, but it's still much higher than anybody would have predicted even a year or 18 months ago. And there is also the added factor that we have a proportional representation system for the Scottish Parliament elections. So I think right now, it would be very, very difficult to see a situation where Reform do not have a quite significant clutch of MSPs in Holyrood after next year. How big that is, I think, remains to be seen. Nigel Farage is what's the right term to use here? He is I don't mean what's the right term to use for Nigel Farage. I would not be that rude in a public forum. What is he? He's tapping into, real problems that people are feeling, real, anxieties and concerns that people have. The economy, living standards, state of public services across the UK right now are, these are real problems that people experience. So I think while he's tapping into that, I think he's being disingenuous in his explanation for the reasons for it and in terms of solutions. The problems of this, whatever you think about the right levels of immigration, all the problems of this country are not caused by immigrants. On the contrary, immigrants do a lot of very important jobs in our country.
But to that extent, do you welcome the exposure that would give them? I mean, to some extent, well, reform, for example, they suddenly have. I'd
rather they weren't elected, but I think they need more exposure and more scrutiny now, frankly, and that's for the media to do. And if people vote for them in an open-eyed way, that's different. But I think the point I'm making is I think those who don't want to see reform elected have to not counter reform by just saying, well, they're bad people and anybody who votes for them are obviously bad people and racist and all the rest of it. There's got to be a recognition of the factors that are driving that support, and people from a different part of the political spectrum than Nigel Farage have to offer the compelling solutions, and I hope that can happen. I hope that can happen across the UK. If the general election in the UK was tomorrow, Farage would be Prime Minister, and that's from my perspective, the really, really bad news. The really, really good news is the election's not tomorrow, and so there's time for those who don't want to see that happen to start taking on his arguments and his approach to things and winning. In my view, you don't do that by kind of trying to ape him or tell him, yeah, you're right on immigration and we'll just be tougher on it. You need to make an argument for the kind of system you want to see, the benefits that immigration bring to the country. If there's problems in the system, fix those. But that goes back to an argument I made earlier on, where a thriving democracy needs people to be prepared to stand up and argue and win arguments on the strength of their own case. And I hope that is what happens, and I hope we will see over the next couple of years the reform threat recede. But it's an open question at the moment.
Question over here.
Hi, I was just wondering how you feel about the possibility of the British Open being hosted at Trump Turnberry.
Of what, sorry?
The British Open, the Golf British Open being hosted at Trump Turnberry.
I would see the thing about almost being out of frontline politics is I'm almost so close to being able to give an answer like I don't really care. I mean it's the RNA or whatever it is that decides that. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. It may well happen in the future. Turnberry is a fantastic golf course, so I think in many respects it would be, great to see the championship happen there. But obviously there's lots of issues, and even if I'm not quite at the point of saying I don't care, I'm definitely at the point of saying it's nothing to do with me. So I don't really have to get into the realms of it. My interactions with Trump were much more around his other golf course in Scotland, the one up near Aberdeen. When I first became First Minister, way before he was President, or a bit before he was President, I used to get through the post what I can only describe as kind of green ink letters from him about the evils of wind power, where he would just send me sort of cuttings from newspapers about how wind power was killing everybody, and he would write in the margins sort of things like crazy ! Or mad ! I mean, I don't know whether he was describing himself or whatever, but anyway, and he took the Scottish Government to court to try to stop the wind farm off the coast of Aberdeen, which he claimed was spoiling the view from his golf course, and lost every stage all the way to the Supreme Court.
And then it's the law, unfortunately.
And it's the law. It's law that Donald Trump was wrong.
Yeah. So, at that point in the book, you also said that he was at pains to invite you for dinner as soon as possible with others. Can't remember, was it family or what?
I was to bring my family to...
Was it not, regardless of what you thought of it, is it not really tempting just to say, yeah,
It was really tempting. So this was when I had a phone conversation with him between his first election and inauguration. So he was president-elect at the time. I think it was December 2016 or thereabouts. And I had this phone conversation. He was on a Trump aeroplane at the time, and I was in my constituency office in Govan Hill. So a bit of a disparity there. And it was it was just, people will often say to me, you know, what's Boris Johnson really like, or what's Donald Trump really like? And you kind of think, well, they're like what you say he is. And so with Trump, this conversation was just a monologue that was sort of, I slightly paraphrase it in the book, but I kind of go through it. It started with, yeah, my mother was Scottish, best mother anybody's ever had, great country, apart from your mad obsession with wind power. Have you seen how well the economy's doing? Best stock market ratings of any president, best poll ratings. And I interjected at one point to ask him, you know, if his sons were going to take over his Scottish businesses now that he was president. Yeah, I've got the greatest sons that anybody's ever had. So it was all this kind of stuff. And then he said, when I'm in the White House, at which point he seemed to say to somebody sitting next to him, when is that? When I'm in the White House, come and visit, bring your family. So I did. It was very tempting just to get my mum and my dad and just turn up on the front lawn of the White House, knock the door and say, we're here. Donald said to visit. So I suspect we might have got sniper treatment.
I think we've got time for one last question.
Right, thank you, Nicola. You've been a lawyer turned politician. How important was that for your career? And there are now some politicians turned lawyer consultants, like David Cameron. Are you going to follow in his footsteps?
No, I don't think so. I'm not going back to the law. I'm pretty certain about that. And consultancy doesn't really, you know, I'm not knocking it. I'm not knocking anybody who does it. It's not what I think would get me jumping out of bed in the morning. So I don't think that's the path I will take. But you know, who knows what life holds in the future. In terms of the sort of law, and Kevin touched on this, the kind of law politics axis. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers in politics, and it's definitely the case that a legal training does give you skills or, you know, kind of mindsets that are helpful in politics. So I don't think it's an accident that lots of lawyers find their way into politics. So I didn't practice law for very long at all, but I do think I got a lot from my legal training that stood me in good stead in what I did choose to do in life.
Thank you. So I think we've reached the end of the session. Can I thank you for coming along to the Academy. Wish you all the very best with the book.
Thank you.
And can I invite everyone else to join in a round of applause for our guest, Nicola?